Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special guest segment of the Home and Away podcast with the news of David Lee joining as Sporting Kansas City's new chief soccer officer for NYCFC yesterday. I thought it would be good to get a little outside perspective on the hire this week. And in that vein, I'd like to welcome Joe Lowery to the podcast. You probably know Joe as a regular contributor to the Total Soccer Show, as well as Backheeled, his wonderful website detailing so much of what's going on in the beautiful game here in the U.S. Joe, welcome. Thanks for taking a moment with us during what seems like a fairly momentous week for the future prospects of Sporting Kansas City.
Absolutely, Drew. I'm a big fan of the show. I love what you guys do. I listen regularly. Thank you so much for having me.
That's great. Thanks, Joe. We love what you do as well, and appreciate you taking the time. So I think to kick this off, we in the home and away sphere and the Sporting Kansas City fan sphere get a little tunnel vision when it comes to Sporting KC. We obviously know this team really well. You know that Cody and I detail so much of what's going on with this team every week. We can get a little myopic. We can get a little bit in our own way sometimes about how we evaluate what's going on. And I think that it's good to get some external perspective, especially on something like this. Chief Soccer Officer David Lee joins from New York City FC, where he has been their Chief Soccer Officer for the last 6 years. What are your thoughts? What was your reaction to this as far as like what you think it means, both for what Sporting Kansas City's ambitions are as well as David Lee's?
Yeah, I mean, my first thought when I saw this come down the pipeline is if I was a Sporting Kansas City fan, I'd be pleased. Is this a home run hire? I don't know. There's a lot of unknowns about David Lee for reasons that maybe we'll talk about that seem pretty obvious within the CFG structure. There are a lot of question marks. But in general, would I be pleased, given how good NYCFC have been for basically most of the time they've been in Major League Soccer and for really almost the entirety of Lee's time leading that front office? Would I be pleased if my team that needs direction went out and hired a guy who'd worked within one of the most prestigious multi-club ownership groups on the planet, who had overseen a roster build that was fairly effective, not just with the initial build that David Lee had when he gets that job in 2019 as CSO for Claudia Reyna. Shout out Claudia Reyna, by the way. But also iterated on that and had relatively stable, continued success and won an MLS Cup. Granted, they weren't the best team in the Eastern Conference that year in 2021, but still a fairly successful team from an Eastern Conference that's generally been better than the West since Lee was over there. Would I be pleased with that? Yeah, even accepting some of the unknowns, I think you have to feel pretty good about this hire, all things considered.
Let's talk about those unknowns, because I think that if anything, as the fans have sort of analyzed this move and tried to sort of wrap their head around it, let's be honest. How many fans know Chief Soccer Officer candidates? How many could you name for most fans, right? So, I don't think anyone was looking into David Lee prior to the announcement, but they certainly started to once it was announced.
Of course.
And that, I think the CFG stuff was probably the first thing that came out, was how much is CFG responsible for his success?
Right.
Or is he actually successful even with the boundaries of CFG in place? Is that actually a positive in his corner regarding that? As well as, was he a little boxed in from a tactical perspective based on how CFG likes their clubs to run? Will that mean that he's a little myopic as a chief soccer officer for Kansas City? There's a lot of questions, I think, from that perspective. So how much do you think CFG and being in that organization really led to his success, as well as I have to believe that part of his interest in going to Kansas City is the fact that he can sort of step out from that structure.
100%. Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this earlier today. I almost wonder how attractive the NYCFC CSO job, a lot of letters in there, a lot of alphabet soup happening there. I wonder how attractive that job is, because yes, they're a prestigious club sort of within MLS. I think when that stadium comes down the pipeline, then that will take them up a notch, maybe even multiple notches into that upper echelon. But really, it is difficult to say how much decision-making power you actually have. And in the example that I point to there, I suppose this is more of a generalization than a specific example, but NYCFC have been one of the youngest teams in Major League Soccer for years and years and years now. And it doesn't take a lot of research to go and scroll through their transfer market page and see, wow, a lot of their biggest outlays are for 19, 20, 21-year-old Uruguayan, Argentine attacking players coming out of South America. And it also doesn't take a whole lot of dot connecting to imagine that CFG are pretty happy to see NYCFC, they're one of their lower rung clubs, all things considered, go and be sort of a farm team and say, oh, wow, we'll go out and have you spend $10 million on Gabriel Pereira or whatever it was from South America. And okay, he's actually not going to hit for us. We're going to move him on to the Middle East and make a big chunk of change off of that. I mean, there's a number of those players. Some have turned out better than others, but that is an example where I would have to imagine, without having spoken to David Lee, that CFG had a pretty sizable influence on some of those decisions. Now, when it comes to coaching hires and really every decision that Lee made, of course he's going to have some input. What that level of input is, truly, I don't know. And that is a bit of a concern, right? That is one thing that makes me think, okay, it's not a home run. Like, you got on base with this hire, I think. But am I going to absolutely say this is a can't miss, David Lee is going to do a great job sort of hire? I really don't know. Like, it would be disingenuous of me to say yes. Again, I feel fairly confident in this hire because of the body of work that NYCFC had over a number of years. And I'd have to imagine that Lee picked up quite a bit from working there. One parallel hire, sort of. Maybe it's not quite parallel, but one name that I've been thinking about over the last 24 hours or so in regards to all this is Khalid El Ahmad in Minnesota, where he is working inside of CFG, inside of City Football Group, scouting North America. And all of a sudden, after a little bit of movement through Barnsley, he comes back to American soccer and is now Minnesota United's chief soccer officer. And Minnesota United have done a lot of really good, smart stuff since he got that job. They hired Eric Ramsey, took their time. It seems like got that hire right, developed a game model, have recruited very well. They partnered with American Soccer Analysis and done some really clever things on the analytics side. David Lee is not Khalid El Ahmad, but in some ways they do share some similar experiences, and that does make me feel quite warm, really, on this hire.
I want to go back to the youth thing for a moment because I do actually think that this is also a potential positive for Sporting. This is a club that has been fairly old for quite some time. Their ability to attract, recruit, and sign good quality young talent has been pretty poor, honestly. Most of their all of their U22s have been either bad or okay. Right. We're finally this year starting to see some sort of intake from their academy again with Jacob Bartlett, Ian James, Jack Courtcamp. But two of those kids are 17. So like realistically, how much impact can they have on the first team roster? There has been a dearth of youth talent on this team. I'm wondering what your thoughts are, is like with a guy as experienced as Lee has been, even if it's in the CFG umbrella, he's certainly gained a bunch of understanding and experience for scouting young players and what value that might have for Sporting.
100%. I think we'd be naive to think that the CFG poll doesn't help NYCFC attract higher level prospects coming in through the U22 initiative to their club. And I don't know that SKC will have that same pull, right? When you take Lee out of that system, I think that is a clear example of the CFG empire really boosting up the sort of level of player he can get. But conceptually, I totally agree with you, Drew. Like, if you're going to go out and hire a guy who has experience finding some of those players, or at least helping in that process in one degree or another, that can't be a bad thing. Someone who has seen those players, who understands what to look for, and maybe also, not quite equally important, but also important, has the contacts to go and leverage all of that stuff. I think if you're thinking about David Lee as someone to lead your club outside of CFG, you're absolutely leaning on some of his contacts, some of his experience, and the benefits that you get picking up from being inside of that CFG system for as long as he was. I think the young player side of things may not be as much of a focus. In fact, I'd be surprised if it was, given that NYCFC really have been so young for so many years. I think there is probably a happy medium in there. I'd have to imagine that Lee would want to find and exist in. But it's absolutely a good thing that he has experience going out there and developing those kinds of players and also knowing how to fit them into the roster building and having someone who knows the league like David Lee. When there is this much stuff to be done, the youth side of that is like one piece of the puzzle. That feels like an advantage for sure.
And also finding a coach that is amenable to using the roster that he's put together and identifying that. Like, you did allude to the fact that there has been some sort of CFG influence in some of his coaching hires. Dome Tarrant, Nick Cushing, those are folks from kind of within the umbrella a little bit. But with Pascal Janssen, he's kind of gone off script a little bit there and has found someone who appears to be really good and probably would be getting more discussion around him if Jesper Sorensen and Mikey Veras didn't exist, right?
Yeah.
Like there would be more conversation around the quality of the coaching hire that they made in New York. Again, if the league wasn't so big and there weren't already some other like outstanding new coach candidates that had joined the league. I want to talk a little bit about what Lee might be excited about when it comes to coming to Kansas City, because obviously he's leaving a job for what is, I guess, technically a lateral move. The title is nice and whatnot, but he's still moving from the chief soccer officer of one team in MLS to the chief soccer officer of another team in MLS. So what is it about this that really got him excited? I think you mentioned this on TSS, but it's basically a blank slate.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, this is a borderline expansion team with two DPs.
Crazy.
And so, and it's not just in the roster; it's also in everything in the front office.
100%.
I think I was at one point in the season, I was told they had something like 7 open recs that they couldn't fill on the technical side, just because there's no CSO, there's no permanent head coach. They can't fill it. And those are just the ones that are open that they weren't able to backfill. There's also a conversation that has been had about building out an analytics staff, building out a scouting staff. Obviously, CFG and helped NYCFC have a fairly strong analytics department, and that was something that Lee was very involved in and has been involved in throughout his career. So as you look at that, the roster obviously being a huge thing that needs to be addressed pretty much immediately in the offseason, there's also like this whole organization that he can sort of build in his own image.
Yeah.
And I think that like starting from like you and I discussed right before we started, the whole concept of building a game model and like slide 1 of what building a game model is, like he's there with this club.
It is as close to an expansion build as you can get without being an expansion build, right? I mean, it's 5 players on the senior roster, including the DPs, who have guaranteed contracts beyond 2025. Like it's insane. Like this is the most expansion-y roster build of any team heading into the 2026 MLS season, right? Now, the downside to that is that you don't have an expansion timeline. Here, you have an offseason, and San Diego FC, the most recent expansion team in MLS, had far longer than that, right? So it is not as if I'm trying to say that SKC will be as good next year as Sporting Kansas City, or even as a number of the more recent expansion teams have been. But still, it doesn't seem difficult for me to imagine why this job is really attractive to people, right? I mean, we both know there are other it seems like highly qualified candidates who are interested coming over from respected European clubs. I know for a fact that David Lee was not the only MLS CSO who's well regarded by many who had at least some casual level of interest in this job. Like that, if there's any positive in all of this for Sporting Kansas City fans, and I think Lee, again, is a good hire. Even with some of the unknowns around about how much the CFG influence mattered and how much to give credit to them or blame to whatever. Even beyond that so many seemingly good people were interested in this role, I think should fill Sporting Kansas City fans with optimism. Again, this is a rebuild, so it's going to take time. But that you have people that want to come in and do this project, yes, for Lee, the elevated title, probably a pay raise, certainly cost of living bump, being able to buy 4 times the land in Kansas City of whatever he could get in New York City, all those things help, right? And a 7-year contract certainly helps as well. Like, you don't find that sort of job security in sports basically ever. All of those things are nice. But there were other people who were interested that maybe would not have needed that same level of security, but who I think would have helped and would have done a good job. For SKC, I think there's so much to be attracted by when it comes to this job posting. I think about basically what you said, Drew, in regards to building out not just the roster again, but everything. When do you get those sorts of opportunities in sports? Like those things just do not come around very often. You get to be the thing that takes an entity from really its lowest point, and that's where Sporting Kansas City are right now, that you get to rebuild them, even if it takes you a while. You're still going to leave it better than you found it. Because how can you not do that? It's basically a no-lose situation for a hire. And not only do you get to rebuild the roster and establish a game model, all these soccer people love their slide decks, right? I'm guessing we've both seen those like game model slide decks that are 95,000 slides long and 47 bajillion times longer than they need to be, right? They love that stuff, right? And it's not just all of that. It's not just the roster build that even these people nerd out over and love like we do. It's also that you get to go out and hire a bunch of like really smart people that you've come across in your career to work with you. And I think that would excite anybody in almost any field. It's not all going to be David Lee and friends, right? But they're going to go out there and hire the best, most qualified people that they can to make this into a real soccer club again, at least relative to the times. So I think all of those things point to, a lot of people wanted this job, and it seems like a pretty darn good one, all things considered.
Yeah, it's sort of just I spent some time last night thinking about where the club is and how it got to this place. Because when you think about this, and I think the ASA guys,
I'm sorry I had to think about that.
Yeah. When the ASA guys did their podcast post Peter Vermees's exit, there was a lot of conversation that reminded me of like how forward thinking this club was in the 2010s. And just, they were the first person to have an analytics guy. Like Rui Shu was an analytics guy when no one had one in MLS. And Rui has since moved on into Kansas State politics, but I mean they Peter Vermees went and hired Megan Cameron from the league office to run their salary cap. They had Mike Jacobs as the technical director. All of these like really smart soccer minds sort of around the building in a time where a lot of teams didn't have very robust front offices. And as those people have exited, for whatever reason, they were never backfilled. They didn't continue to iterate on that and build on that. And it brings them to this state. And I find it interesting because if you look at quotes from Mike Illig, if you hear what they have to say, especially on the business side of the club, they are very analytically minded in how they run the business of Sporting Kansas City. It is well respected within the league as being one of the best run clubs in the league from a business perspective. They consistently have the best partnerships. They consistently have just like they run the club exceptionally well. And so for on the soccer side, for it to have fallen to the level it has is indicative of, a larger problem. And we can spend hours talking about when was the right time to move on from Peter Vermees and the sort of hole that it left behind and how they're trying to have to dig themselves out of it. And this is obviously the first step of that. But it is, to your point, an opportunity to really be aggressive about pushing forward with that. And I do agree with you that with Lee being from that structure of CFG, he's seen what good looks like. He knows what is needed and can bring that expertise. And the 7-year contract and the title bump and the pay raise and all that is indicative of a couple things, in my opinion. One, both he and the club are bought into this project long term. Like they are very, very much hand in hand on this thing as far as like making the investment in both financially in his pay, but his contract, length of contract, all of that to really like get together to do this right. But additionally, I'm sure that he did not make this decision without some other guarantees, promises regarding roster spending, regarding investment in infrastructure and people in the front office. So this is not a guy who leaves New York City who wanted to keep him. Like they did not want him to leave. He doesn't leave that job without some significant guarantees. And so I think both of those are potentially pretty good positives for where this might be going.
I think it's just an exciting time. Like this, I think you said something about this, Drew, in what you were just saying. This is the first step. Right now there's a whole bunch of other work to do, but this now finally allows you to kick off the new era. And is it frustrating that it took this long? Yeah, it is. Like you had Peter Vermees fired a long time ago. There was time to maybe move this ship along a little bit quicker. Ultimately, does that really matter? Probably not, right? Not a ton in the grand scheme of things. Now you can go out there and do all the other fun, interesting stuff that you have to do, right? Like it's not just about nailing the CSO hire and all of a sudden all of your problems go away. I think the encouraging thing here in all of this is that all signs are pointing to Sporting Kansas City not just hiring David Lee to do half of Peter Vermees' job from before. Like it's them hiring David Lee as the first step of what's going to be a pretty lengthy plan to make this team better than they've been in a long time and to catch them back up to speed with the rest of the MLS world, which is that's not the kind of thing that takes years, right? One of the things that I think about in MLS all the time is that these sorts of rebuilds, even extensive ones, don't have to take 3 years, right? I think about 3 examples in recent MLS history. FC Cincinnati, when Chris Albright and Pat Noonan come in, they get that team back up to speed quickly. They go from being the worst team that MLS has literally ever seen to being now a team that has had maybe the most success over the last 3 seasons. It doesn't take long. It didn't take long for those guys. I think about the LA Galaxy and how quickly they turn things around when Will Kuntz comes into that job and he goes and snags Peck and Paintsel and makes some moves around the middle of the roster and they're winning MLS Cup. I think about Minnesota United as the other example that I got to earlier with Khalid Al-Ahmad coming in. That did not take them long to go from Adrian Heath to being the 6th seed in the Western Conference now to being probably a top 4 team in the West that's gotten a bit unlucky with player movement at a bad time. But still, those are 3 recent examples of existing MLS teams that have boosted their front office, who have gone and thought about things a little bit differently than how they were before. And all of a sudden, those have been, okay, forget the LA Galaxy this year, but 3 of the best teams in MLS in recent history. It does not take a ton of time to do this. It's hard. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of manpower, all that stuff. But Sporting Kansas City finally have accomplished the first step of that with a very reasonable, respectable hire of someone who is well regarded from everyone that it sounds like both you and I have talked to around Major League Soccer. It's just hard to ask for a lot more than that to get this thing going.
Yeah, I think the opportunity starts obviously with the roster. That is the most most significant. The 6-month thing, yes, I think all of us would like to have had it move faster. I'm not sure realistically it would have made much difference. There's all of these contracts don't come off the books.
Roster wise, it makes basically no difference. The only difference possibly is you get started on like hiring out your staff in a way, and now that St. Louis have you're competing in a way that maybe you wouldn't have been before. But I'd still rather get the person I want for the CSO job than do it 2 months earlier. Ultimately.
Exactly. I think that was what the club focused on was make sure we get the guy we really want, and we'll eat some time in order to do that, and with the understanding that maybe it won't be perfect next year, but we'll be going in the right direction. And so with that roster, like you said, there's only 5 guys who are guaranteed under contract on the senior roster next year. They have 2 DPs in Joveljic and Manu Garcia. Daniel Shalhoub is in the last year of his most recent deal. Jake Davis, those are kind of the key players, which is weird to say, under contract next year. What are your thoughts of like what this team could be doing, especially with someone like Lee and his experience and being very active in the transfer market?
I mean, I would think that those U22 spots would be something of a priority, along with what could be a little bit of DP movement. This was interesting, and I haven't heard anything on this, but I know Andrew Wiebe had sort of maybe alluded to the fact that there could be some DP movement coming out, maybe coming in. We'll see what that looks like. You may have thoughts on that, Drew. It looks like you do. Do you want to add something?
I do. I think he's referring to Joveljic when he said that. And I don't have any reporting on this, but it's more along the lines of I think the opportunity, like a player like Joveljic, he's 26.
He's got interest.
He's on his, 3rd out of 4 seasons with double-digit goal contributions. He's actually scored more goals this year than he did with the Galaxy last year.
And he's done it all for mostly bad teams. I know what I said about the Galaxy earlier.
Like let's be honest, Sporting Kansas City is not a chance-creating machine. He is still somehow scoring pretty regularly. So I think that there will always be interest in him, and they could flip him for money very quickly if they wanted to. So I would expect if a new CSO was to be aggressive and want to try to really change the roster over, Joveljic would probably be the player for it. I don't think Garcia is the guy, mainly because Garcia came here with the understanding that he was joining a project and wanting to be a part of that.
Sure.
And it seems to be that is sort of his fit within the locker room. Whereas Joveljic was more of they jumped on a really nice opportunity when it became available. And I'm not saying he's looking for the door. I'm just saying that there will be 8-figure offers for him, of course.
It makes sense. It makes sense, right? He is a player in prime who's produced across multiple seasons, who had a pretty good reputation in Europe before he comes to MLS in the first place. Like that all totally tracks. But really, when it comes to what you do with this roster, the answer is you do basically everything with this roster. I know you guys have talked about on the show, you and Cody. Like there are very few players that should be back next year, right? I mean, very, very few players that should be back next year. I'm not intrigued by many of these options. I suppose that if you zoom out and you press me to be more specific, I would say the attack is the thing that is closest to being good, right? But it doesn't mean it doesn't need a little TLC,
still a long
right?
ways away.
You're at least
it's closer than the defense, but that's a low bar, right?
If you keep Joveljic, let's just say that happens, right? And you keep Garcia because either you rate him or you think it's going to be hard to get back what you paid for him, all that sort of stuff. You're at minimum one high level starting player away in that attack from having a good attack. And that's putting maybe more on Daniel Shalhoub than I would personally like to. I imagine he's a guy that you keep around. So, I mean, all I'm saying is
Shalhoub's numbers over the last 5 years are as good as David Lee's. Let's be completely honest. Like he compares very well as a winger in this league.
Yeah,
I know. I feel like he's one of those guys that gets overlooked a lot. He's not a DP level player, and so many teams have DP level attackers on the wings.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Sometimes he gets lost, but he compares very favorably to say Jordan Morris.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't think anyone would suggest that Jordan Morris should be leaving Seattle. So
Right.
I think that from when you take that into account, Shallowy is a big key part of it. But I think we can also agree that Shabi Suleimanov is not it.
Yeah.
So they have to do something in the attack. And if Eric Tommy is out of contract, they've got some ability financially to invest a little bit on the TAM side of things to perhaps improve that attack. So I agree with that.
100%. Like you're at minimum one high level starter away from having an attack that personnel wise, I mean, tactically there's stuff to nail down there, of course, with the game model, with the coach, all that stuff. But you're one piece away on paper from the attack being pretty good, like decent at minimum, sort of. But there is work to do in the attack, and then there's a lot of work to do downfield. I'm not a Pulskamp guy myself. I don't think he's been very good this year. I think you probably need someone to at least come in and compete for that starting job. I think you need starting level players, like good starting level players in the back 7 for this team, or back 6, I guess, the double pivot in the back 4 if you are going to play some sort of 4-2-3-1 with Garcia or whatever it is, right? You need a lot of turnover, and that you can go out and have as much flexibility as you have. Again, that is super attractive. Like there's a ton of names to go out there and identify and to negotiate with and to deal with and all that stuff. But there are no shortage of positions that need upgrading on to go out and put those players on the 11 with.
I agree completely, and I think that the expectation would be through the level of interviews that Lee has gone through at this point that a plan has already been presented to ownership about how he would go address this.
Coach candidates, player thoughts, like very much just to emphasize. Even if you are interviewing for a lower level job in an MLS front office, like you're going to have real life application questions, sort of that go through those interviews, at least in most scenarios, of like, hey, let's talk about the roster that you would have some input in if you were to get this job. What do you make of this player? What do you make of this group? What do you think needs to be different? What are we missing now? What could we have more of? Those are the kinds of questions that get asked, and even at lower level entry point jobs into these kind of sporting organizations. So yes, Lee very much would have gone through a bunch of those things already, and almost certainly has a lot of plans in place.
Yeah, the big one for me is finding the best place to put Manu Garcia on the field. I think you mentioned kind of a 4-2-3-1 with him at that 10. I just don't think he's that type of player. I think he's more of a central midfielder. You see, he's a ball progression machine.
Yeah,
he's really exceptional at getting the ball forward into the attacking zones and then hitting the dinked pass or the next thing. But he's not a 10 in the way that Evander is, or the way that Carlos Gil is, or any of these guys who are sort of goal dangerous as well as being, final ball guys. And so I really appreciate his game a lot, but I think a lot of people compare him to other 10s in the league, which are, generally more like inside forwards, attacking wingers, as well as being creative players. And that's just not him. That's not the style of player he is. And I think the problem that Sporting has is their defense is so bad, they can't pull him back into a double pivot because he's not defensively, solid enough to be in that position. So really, I think there are some opportunities for them to sort of reset how the team plays a little bit. Like, people who listen to the podcast all the time know that I've been pining for a box midfield for a while. Just because I think that with Tommy and Shallowy, you have inside sort of half spacey guys that could play in front of a double pivot, and it could be a little bit more effective. But for whatever reason, that's not been happening. I do think it creates problems on the defensive side, and this team's so bad defensively that they couldn't do it. But I think maximizing Garcia's positives is going to be really important. Your DPs should be the players that you're building your game model around.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. I want to go back in on Garcia because I know you've rated him from even before pen was officially to paper or social media post was to timeline sort of on Garcia. And he's a fun player, right? I'm a sucker for a ball progressor as much as the next guy. I do sort of wonder, and I guess part of my beef with Garcia and not maybe rating him as much as you do is spending a DP spot on a ball progressor is probably not a decision that I would make. Right, I mean, this is a bit of an extreme example, and I suppose I'm cherry picking here. But since NYCFC are top of mind, Keaton Parks might be the best ball progressing midfielder in MLS. He's not a DP, right, over at NYCFC.
Right.
Now, granted, he's also never on the field because he's got a bunch of injury issues. So it's not like you would just find these elite ball progressing midfielders like they're growing on trees. But I do have some concerns about how you maximize a system because I agree your DP should factor heavily into how you build out your game model. But if you want Garcia to do what he's best at, he needs to be deeper in midfield. And if that's the case, you mentioned the defensive deficiencies, that's a problem. And you're already paying a bunch of money to a guy who is doing a skill that matters,
Right.
but that matters a whole lot less than most of the other players that are being employed as DPs by other teams in Major League Soccer. Like that to me is a big problem.
Okay. I mean, I look at his game a little bit different. I don't think he just stops after he progresses the ball. He still has a lot of passing capability from zone 14. If he's on the ball in zone 14, he does. It's more of the chipped ball over or kind of finding that sort of diagonal run from the corner of the box that he's pretty good at. He does also make the fourth run a lot, which is something that is more of a central midfield type thing than it is an attacking player type thing. I just think that, first of all, as you noted, it's Joveljic and Shallowy. That's it. That's the only attackers he has to play with.
For sure.
So there are limitations there. One of the guys in our Discord described him this way, and it actually, I laughed, but it also is really true when you look at his underlying numbers. He's like Darlington Nagby, but he knows about offense.
Yeah.
So like, and Darlington Nagby was a DP at one point. Now maybe you don't spend a DP slot on a prime Darlington Nagby anymore, but also Darlington Nagby wasn't near as effective in zone 14 as Garcia is. So I think there is more to him than just that, but I do agree with you that he needs more of the goal dangerous type people in front of him to maximize his capabilities.
Yeah.
And they just don't have them right now.
And let me put it this way. I fully expect that Manu Garcia in 2026 will look better than Manu Garcia in 2025, right? I mean, that would floor me if that were not the case. It might not be night and day, but I would certainly expect to see a better Manu Garcia with presumably, because how could they not be, better pieces around him, right? I mean, I think we are seeing sort of the floor of Garcia. I just question, again, in like a macro roster building theory sense, if you can get the most out of a team when you have used a DP spot on someone like that. At the same time, probably not too far away from the roster rules looking a bit different than they are today. So maybe none of this actually ends up mattering. And by the time Sporting Kansas City are close to being realized, they've got more room to play with anyway.
Or they can get him to sign an extension at the end of next year and get his transfer fee off of his cap charge. There's a variety of things that they could do. I do think part of Manu Garcia he was signed when Peter Vermees was still the chief soccer officer, and he is the platonic ideal of the Peter Vermees 810.
Totally.
So when that has a lot to do with why he's on the roster now, and that is also an issue with the Peter Vermees system. It is so dependent on very specific types of players, and I think Lee has an opportunity here to make the roster a little bit more malleable in the way that it is used.
Do you think, because based off everything we've said about Garcia and what I've seen of him generally speaking, I think he's actually a fine fit for that 8-10 role. Am I way off on that? Like if you have the right pieces to make that system work. Yeah, okay.
Especially
that's what I was thinking.
It would require them getting more central midfielders. Like that's the problem, is they just don't have them. They've got Zoran Basong playing in a double pivot
that doesn't do
with
it for
Jake
you?
Davis. No, it doesn't. So, I mean, to your point, in the front six, they have so much work to do. I like Jake Davis. I think he's a fine player, but I think he's far from a 2,500 minute MLS starter at central midfield. So, and maybe he can start to elevate that. The more he plays, the more he's pushed around better players. But Nemanja Radoja is not the guy pushing him, right? Correct. So, like this is more indicative of just how poor the roster has been built over the last several years, and the fact that David Lee has the opportunity, with a lot of these guys exiting, to make some changes to it.
Drew, can I ask you, sort of turning the tables here, because I'm curious, and you've seen more of SKC this year than I have, and you've watched them more intently, of course, than I have.
Right.
Where would you use let's say these guys, these two DPs come back next year.
Yeah.
What position would you use that third DP on? I guess, like, so what sort of player would you be looking for? And then if you want to toss in any U22 thoughts that you have, I'd be curious about those as well. But
yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's really dependent on what they do with what the plan is for how the team wants to play. I mean, the first thought is right wing. Like that is the first thought for me, is a right winger. You need a more dynamic attacker. Almost every single team in the league has at least two frontline DPs.
Yep.
That either, so like in the example of, like, say an FC Cincinnati where they have Denke and Evander. Evander is he's in the front line, right? He's not retreating. I mean, he does get back on the ball sometimes, but
two like very clearly attack minded DPs.
Exactly. Yep. And right now I don't believe that Sporting has that. So if they're gonna go for a third DP, it needs to be on the attacking line, and I don't think you do it in a position where Shallowy is already there.
Yeah, agreed.
So maybe you have a player who can play either side as needed, but if you're gonna cash out a transfer fee for someone like that, I would be looking for someone in their around their prime as an attacking right winger. That would be where I would look at using that role. But if you can get a legitimate Evander type 10, I would be okay with that, with Manu moving deeper behind him.
Yep. Yeah, and then you go out and get a ball-leading number 6 and
Exactly.
I mean, yeah, there are ways to make this work. And that is one of the things that I will say does intrigue me about Garcia. There are different worlds that I can imagine living in where he is a useful player in a few different positions on the field. I do think that he has some flexibility that with the right pieces around him, he could be maximized in a few different ways. But yeah, my mind also is going to the right wing. It just feels like, as you said, it's an obvious place where teams spend DP spots. There is a big old hole there in terms of production for Sporting Kansas City. You certainly wouldn't spend it up top on the 9, and it doesn't make any sense to do it in Shalloway's spot when he's under contract next year and can be. I know you guys have talked about this recently. He can be a culture guy. There are precious few of those around, and probably for good reason. But you need something, right? You need something that's going to help elevate the pieces and parts around that you have, that you want to bring in, that you have now bringing through the ranks on the youth side. So yeah, the right way makes a ton of sense to me.
But they could also go 2DP for U22 and look for a David Martinez type of player as well, right?
Yeah.
I would be perfectly fine with that. I would be perfectly fine for them picking up the phone and trying to buy David Martinez from LAFC.
Same. That's a great shot.
That would be, do a cash for, make him a U22 and move on. The problem with U22s is that they're so hit or miss. And even NYCFC has had a lot of misses, and that has been some of the criticism towards Lee during his time there. Is you spend $8 million on a 19-year-old player. There's a lot of unknowns at that point in time. I do think you alluded to the fact that he had been pretty good at getting money back for a lot of those players. Totally. So it's not like they were running a significantly negative transfer budget in New York City. In fact, the exact opposite. I think if you look over the last 3 years, they're in the green fairly significantly, which is also a thing that Sporting has not done. They have not sold players. They just haven't.
Alan Polito would like a word with you, sir.
Yeah.
I mean, that is one of the greatest deals of all time in MLS.
I mean, I give Mike Burns a lot of credit for actually getting money out of that guy. I don't
100%.
know. I don't know how they got money for Polito, but they did, and it's one of the more astounding transfers.
I do think. Sorry to interject. I mean, my tongue is only partially in cheek about the Polito outgoing deal as being one of the best in league history. It's an amazing deal. I love the David Martinez shout. That's somebody that I have tossed around to people around the league and just sort of tossed out on TSS as a guy that I would 100% go out there and make an offer for. I don't know if David Martinez wants to be in MLS much longer. I don't know what the deal is there, but LAFC don't use him as much as his talent would warrant. I do think, when we see cash flows happen around MLS, they're DPs and U22s, so that you can absorb those fees into their roster designation. They don't need to be a big deal. I would be very curious to see how Lee operates the U22s outside of the CFG umbrella, where before they very clearly were just throwing darts at the board, right? And somewhat educated.
In South America.
Mostly, yeah, right. In South America for obvious reasons that we talked about.
Which is what CFG does. I mean, they've been doing that with Troyes. They've been doing that with Girona. They've been doing all those teams.
As they should. That. I mean, that is exactly what I would do in that situation, I think. But outside of the CFG group, I do wonder if I just did ATM machine CFG group. That's tough. I do wonder if Lee looks around at some targets and says, I would like to lessen the risk of some of these things. There are U22s in MLS that would be worth going after. If you have a little bit of investment from ownership to go out there and get something that is closer to a proven commodity. Martinez is not the only one. I also imagine there's going to be a bunch of MLS teams sniffing around some of the same guys. But if you think you've got the backing to go and get in on those sweepstakes, do it, man. 100% agree.
It's a significantly lower risk option than going down to South America and paying $8 million for a guy that plays for Racing Club, right? Yep. It's significantly lower risk, and that I think that's also what you're seeing with some of the domestics, right? The domestic players, the Jack McGlynn's of the world, kind of converting to other teams' U22s as part of this cash for system, where they may or may not be able to get that type of wage or that type of playing time in their current environment. I think the Phillies of the world will continue to use it as an ATM of their own. Yeah. With their FC Dallas is another organization you could see over time. They haven't been building out the homegrowns in the way they had in the teens, but they certainly have a history of doing it. So I think that there's opportunities there as well on the domestic side of things. So it's an interesting thought process. There's a lot for David Lee to work on. Joe, thank you so much for joining me for a little bit to break it down. I really appreciate your perspective and helping us sort of understand from an outsider's point of view how we feel about what Sporting Kansas City is doing.
Yeah, Drew, thanks a ton for having me. I said this to you before we started. There are few things in MLS that are more interesting to me right now than Sporting Kansas City. I think the potential is really, really high, and we just don't see these kinds of wholesale changes happen very often. So I'll be watching eagerly from the outside to see what this looks like.
Awesome, Joe. Well, appreciate it again, and everyone, make sure to tune in every week as Cody and I break down the team, and we will talk to y'all soon. Bye-bye.